Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being willing to talk today about the big picture of American foreign policy. And I want to start with the fact that both you and President Biden have made it very clear that you're rethinking and reorienting American foreign policy. Why is this moment so important, and how is it different than where we've been?
Well, Heather, first, it's wonderful to talk to you today. Thanks for spending the time. I think there are a few things going on here. One is this. We see democratic systems around the world, including our own, challenged in a variety of ways. One of the most important challenges is to make sure, as the President said, that we have democracies that are actually delivering for people and the government works. Because if it's not, or it's not seen to, people are going to go in another direction. And so there are very concrete problems that we've identified and that have a strong domestic component, but also an international one. Supply chains. We saw the disruption that we had in supply chains during COVID. And as a result, people simply couldn't get the products they needed, they wanted in their daily lives on a timely basis, or the prices went way up. We've done a lot of work working with other countries to come together to try to make sure that we had more secure supply chains, that we weren't dependent on just one country or one region for things that we needed, that we could together identify some kind of disruption to the supply chain and then act to fix it really, really fast. We brought together countries to do just that. If you go down the line on very practical things that really affect Americans, the first question we ask ourselves, the President asked us to ask ourselves, is how's this going to affect people here at home? How is what we're doing on anything going to make things a little bit more secure, a little bit more filled with opportunity, a little bit healthier for our people and hopefully for other people around the world?
Can you walk us through that with manufacturing just a little bit? Because one of the things we all look about on the domestic side is that the Biden administration has brought back a lot of manufacturing.
Yeah.
And yet, I know the State Department talks about it. What are you talking about?
So we're talking about a few things. First, the President believes strongly that we needed to not just talk about reviving manufacturing in this country, but actually doing it. And that's exactly what's happened. If you look at the number of jobs that have been created in manufacturing industries over the last 3.5 years, it's quite extraordinary. And making sure that we had the ability as necessary to make things here at home that we needed so that we could reduce dependencies on certain countries that might not show up when we needed them to, or you might have a supply chain disrupted. That was important. Tapping into the fact that this has been the heart of the American enterprise, basically almost since our founding, moving out of agriculture, moving into manufacturing. He's worked to revive that. But there are other things that are going on here and that directly connect us. When you have a country, in this case, China, that is a major manufacturer in the world, but in some instances does this in a profoundly unfair way, heavily subsidizing what they're producing, and then sending all of the overcapacity, everything that they've manufactured beyond their own needs, to markets around the world, flooding those markets with underpriced goods, taking the feet out from under our own manufacturers or manufacturers in other countries in ways that can devastate communities, devastate companies, devastate workers. Part of our job in the State Department is to make sure that we're bringing countries together to get China away from those practices. When we're doing that alone, as the United States, if we didn't have the benefit of building these coalitions of countries to engage a country like China when it's doing something we don't like, we're about maybe a quarter of the world's economy. If all of a sudden you have the United States, Europe, key countries in Asia working together and saying this has to change, that's maybe 50 or 60% of the world's economy. That's such a powerful weight, a heavy weight, that a country like China can't ignore. Our job in the State Department is to bring all of these countries together to try to get that result so it doesn't come back here in the United States and devastate a community that is on the receiving end of unfair pricing and goods that get dumped on us. As we look at history and as we look at this moment, if the United States is not engaged, if we're not leading, then you're likely to see one of two things. Either some other country doing it, but probably not in a way that's going to advance our interests and our values, or maybe just as bad, no one doing it And then you tend to get a vacuum that'll be filled by bad things before it's filled by good things. So without us, without our engagement, without our leadership, we see a world that moves in a direction that's going to be even less friendly to Americans of the United States. But there's a flip side to that. And the flip side is this. I've been doing this for more than 30 years now. I can't think of a moment when the multiplicity of challenges and the complexity of challenges has demanded as much as it does now, finding ways to cooperate, to coordinate, to communicate with others. Because as powerful as we are, as strong as we are, we simply are not as effective meeting these different challenges alone. And so that's put a premium for the president on trying to re-energize, in some cases reimagine, our alliances and partnerships around the world. So these two things, engagement, leadership, but also cooperation, coordination, partnership, alliances, that's really how we've approached this moment.
So we all remember the Cold War and the idea that there was a conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, and the world sort of divided along those lines. And then on the heels of that, you've talked about how people expected that we would have a period of greater liberalization and better human rights,
That's right.
and people moving out of poverty. And in fact, that happened to a large degree. So why aren't we in a moment when we just sit back and, celebrate?
I wish we could be, and you're exactly right. Of course, by so many measures, in so many ways, we have seen extraordinary progress. Hundreds of millions of people, more, lifted out of extreme poverty. That continues. We've managed to avoid another global conflict after the Second World War. That's a huge achievement, considering where the world was. We've seen extraordinary advances in technology and information. All of these things have led to so many positive developments for people around the world and in the United States. But we've also seen a flip side to many of these developments, many of these challenges. I think we've seen a return to some extent to great power competition, because we've seen both the emergence of China, which has different views on what the international system should look like, different views than the ones that we've had and that we've led on for the last 80 years. We've seen a reassertion of Russian power after the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, but now a revanchist Russia, one that unfortunately seeks to recreate what it lost. Those pose particularly big challenges for us in very different ways. And then at the same time, a whole host of global problems, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's technology that can leap any barrier, both for good but also for bad, that are creating challenges that, again, none of us can actually deal effectively with alone. So I think this has put a premium on finding ways both to deal with countries that want to disrupt the system in ways that are not in our interests, but also finding ways to cooperate more effectively on dealing with these big global challenges that will come back and bite Americans as well. I mean, think of it this way. Let's say you care about climate change. Well, we're about 15% of global emissions. Even if we got everything right at home, you've got to deal with the other 85%, which means we've got to find ways to work with other countries on that. If you care about a pandemic, and we've all been through the COVID experience, even if we do everything right at home, we're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. We have a strong interest in making sure that that global health system is strong so that people can see something emerging and deal with it effectively. These phones we carry around in our pockets every day that so shape our lives, the rules by which they're used, will they protect our privacy or will they undermine it? Will they enable repressive dictators to lord it over their people, or will they make it easier for those who want to advance freedom and openness to succeed? If we're not at the table when those rules are decided, then we know they're going to come out in a different way.
All right, so is it fair to say that with the collapse of the post-Cold War order, we had not only the benefits of that collapse, but also the rise of revanchist dictatorships, authoritarians, and the concentration of wealth in certain places.
That's right.
Which has disrupted the global powers. And now it seems to me anyway, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, that what the Biden administration and the State Department under your direction has tried to do is to create a new way of the United States interacting with the world without simply imposing its will elsewhere, but rather creating a more representational system of international stable systems within which people can work, not necessarily to engage in wars or to stop wars, but rather prevent wars and work forward toward the kinds of situations you're thinking about.
Yeah.
Health, technology, climate change, and so on.
I think it's a very good way of putting it. Look, let's talk about for a minute about preventing wars. One of the most effective ways to do that is through our alliances and partnerships. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That alliance is now 32 countries strong. We just brought in 2 new members, Finland and Sweden, countries that actually for years had stayed on the outside of NATO and tried to remain, for very understandable reasons, away from conflict, away from getting pulled into alliances. But when they saw the Russian aggression against Ukraine, they thought we could be next. The power of something like NATO is that there's a basic understanding at the heart of this alliance, which is if one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked, and we'll all respond. And that means if you're a would-be aggressor, if you're thinking about attacking one of these countries, you know that if you take on one of us, you take on all of us. And that's a powerful, powerful deterrent to an aggressor actually taking action.
I noticed that the troops came away from the Finnish border and moved down to the Ukraine border.
That's exactly right.
Right after that, the organization of Finland going into NATO. But you've not just focused on NATO. I mean, one of the things that people talk about when they talk about this moment is that you are not simply trying to revive the post-World War II order, which I believe both you and the president have said are somewhat outmoded, but you're creating new partnerships, especially in the Indo-Pacific, and focusing on making them more representative and on creating what I like to think of as ad hoc committees to address specific things.
That's exactly right. So it's so important that we have what you can call ad hoc committees, coalitions of common purpose, different sizes, different shapes, that are really fit for particular purposes, because not every country is interested in taking on every challenge. Some countries have particular strengths when it comes to meeting something that we need to do, others maybe less so. So, to give you examples, it's not only about reviving all of the traditional alliances that we had. And when we came into office, they were in serious disrepair. And we have revived them, we've re-energized them. But we've also created new ones. We've also brought different groupings of countries, and not just countries, subnational actors. It may be mayors, it may be governors, because so much of what gets done in a country happens at a much more local level. It may be businesses, it may be NGOs. Each of these actors, in ways that were not the case before, because they're so empowered by technology information, their voice carries a lot more weight than it ever did before. So we tried to bring them together in these different coalitions of common purpose to meet a discrete challenge. One example, fentanyl, the #1 killer of Americans aged 18 to 49. It's not a heart attack, it's not a car accident, it's not a gun, it's a synthetic opioid, fentanyl. 40% of Americans know someone who has died from an opioid overdose. But this is a problem that almost by definition is not going to be solved just in the United States, because the way fentanyl tends to come into the United States is the chemicals that go into making it may get manufactured halfway around the world, for example in China. They then get shipped close to our borders, maybe to Mexico, synthesized into an opioid. And these are perfectly legal chemicals that have perfectly legitimate purposes, but then get diverted. Right. And then it comes into our country and kills hundreds of thousands of people. So we put together a coalition of countries now, 150 countries that are working together to deal with this problem, because we've been the canary in the coal mine. What's happened here in the United States on synthetic opioids, we now see happening in other places. So countries have a real concern. Bringing them together, sharing information, making sure we have best practices in terms of dealing with this problem, how we engage the chemical manufacturers, how we engage online platforms where people are advertising this stuff, how we can make sure that we're enforcing our laws together, makes us so much more effective. And President Biden reached an agreement with China to make sure that they were doing more to crack down on these companies that are making the chemicals and then diverting them into illicit use.
So can you walk us very briefly through what that looks like? When you see a problem like that, or I know we've done something similar with immigration from Latin America.
That's right.
There's a number of different organizations that you've done precisely that, and there's a number with the Pacific Islands and so on. Like, literally, what do you do?
One of the things that's very, very powerful in the U.S. government is, of course, we have a State Department that's focused on these things every day, but we also have other departments that have different parts of a given problem, whether it's maybe the Defense Department, maybe the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the Trade Representative, you name it. And we've had a system that's developed over many years that brings all of them together, all the different stakeholders around the same table, so that a little bit like the blind mice and the elephant, we make sure that we've got every piece of this that we can put together. But for the State Department, our first response is, okay, we've identified the problem. Now, who do we believe will have an interest in helping to solve it? Who may have the same problem that we have, or maybe seeing that same problem emerge in the coming years? Engaging them, coming together, and whether it's informal or something more formal, bringing these different countries together, bringing these different stakeholders together, that's really exactly what we do every single day.
So literally, you would write to somebody, email them, call them?
First of all, we have ambassadors and embassies in nearly 200 countries. They'll go into their host government, and they may start and say, Washington just asked us to raise this with you because we see a real problem here, and we see the best way to solve it is working together. I'll pick up the phone and call my counterpart, a foreign minister in a given country. We have all sorts of extraordinary diplomats working here, each of whom has counterparts. But for us, if we can put together the strongest, the best possible idea for how to tackle it, and then rally others to it, that's actually how we get it done.
Well, and that may answer my next question. Why is it important for the United States to be involved in these things? That is, one of the things that you see all the time nowadays is the idea that America should pull back and let other countries do whatever they want to do, and we should focus solely on America.
After World War I, it was understandable. We wanted to bring everyone home. We did. And then we had some basic decisions to make, given the way the world was evolving. We decided not to join the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. We started to see economic problems arise. We became protectionist. We tried to basically put ourselves behind a wall. We saw the rise of dictators in Europe. We became isolationist. We had new waves of immigrants coming to this country, which has been the history of this country. From the beginning, we became xenophobic. We wound up at the end of the 1930s with a world war, economic depression, a global depression, and a genocide. But then, after World War II, we got something that doesn't come around very often, which is a do-over. The same set of decisions had to be made. And again, it was understandable. We could have just come home and hunkered down. We didn't do that. We could have used that moment to assert our own primacy, because after World War II, the United States was standing well above everyone else, mostly because everyone else had been so devastated, whether it was in Europe or in Asia. We didn't do that. Instead, we took the lead, but working with others, to try to create this system of understandings, of rules, of norms and standards. And we did something that was counterintuitive. We bound ourselves to them when we didn't have to, but we did. We played by the same rules. Now, very imperfect, didn't get everywhere that it wanted to get, but it reflected a basic understanding that we have of what's in America's interest, and it's something that we called enlightened self-interest. We didn't do these things out of altruism. We did it because we thought it would actually be best for our standing and for our people in terms of meeting their interests. So when we made these investments in other countries after World War II, we got new partners, the Marshall Plan, NATO itself, the international financial institutions. We got new partners who helped us deal with new challenges that no single country could deal with alone. We got new allies who could actually deter aggression, prevent war from happening in the first place. New markets where our companies, our workers, could sell their products. So I think when we think about that and we face decisions that are not dissimilar now, we're very much animated by that, this notion of enlightened self-interest, of doing things that make others stronger and more effective because it also makes us stronger and more effective.
And yet you're not suggesting moving back to that system. You're actually suggesting moving forward to
You have
a
to.
new system.
You have to, because, of course, the world is not as it was 80 years ago. New countries have emerged. Their voices need to be heard. New actors, as I said, have emerged. And whether it's a corporation, whether it's an NGO, whether it is some group that has come together and now has the ability, because of technology, because of information, to really have its voice heard, they have to be factored in. And as I see it, if you're not getting everyone in on the takeoff, again, you're going to have a very hard landing. So we have to make sure we have a system that's actually more reflective of the world as it is. Voices that weren't there or weren't heard 80 years ago need to be heard now. Africa, 1 out of 4 people on this planet will be from the African continent in the next 30 years. And of course, it's an incredibly young population that's going to do a lot to shape the future. They have to be factored in. The president was determined to make sure that, for example, Africa had a seat at the table of the G20, the 20 leading economies in the world. Now it does. We're working on the UN Security Council and trying to see how that can be reformed to more accurately reflect what the world looks like today.